Our fourth and final section for chapter 1 here is going to be the most important and probably actually the longest as well for this entire chapter. And this is when we're going to start talking about moving from all of the different ideas and theories and opposing fields of thought from the earlier sections and moving into our more modern perspectives. And as I've kind of hinted before, these modern perspectives are things that are going to come up pretty much continually as we move through the other chapters throughout the semester. So for each of those upcoming topics, we're really going to end up discussing how each of these upcoming perspectives tends to approach whatever topic is being focused on in that chapter. So we'll look at things like what kinds of questions would they ask if they approached it from this perspective, or what kind of research might be common from that particular perspective. So this is the section of this chapter that is the most important for the rest of the semester, so these are very important. So I highly recommend that you learn them very well now because they're going to continue to become relevant. Now, for each of these, we are going to go through them in pretty much numerical or I guess time order, starting earlier on. But as per usual, I don't really care about the specific dates. What I'd much rather you keep in mind are things like how do each of these perspectives play off of each other? Just like we've seen in the earlier sections where we had, say, our structuralism and functionalism having almost opposing thoughts on a very similar topic, we're going to see a lot of that here, where oftentimes perspectives are going to come into power or become more popular because individuals oppose other popular perspectives. So be able to answer questions like, why is this perspective coming into power at this time? And how do they relate to some of the other perspectives? What might they agree on or disagree on? But with that little bit of a disclaimer, what is our first perspective? We're going to talk about the psychodynamic perspective or the psychodynamic school of thought. And typically, whenever you hear this term psychodynamic or you hear psychoanalysis, you're really going to start thinking about Freud. And by the end of the semester, you're definitely going to think Freud instantaneously. However, there are other names that are associated with this particular perspective. We have individuals who came before Freud, as well as some neo-Freudians who came after him. And for now, we're going to focus on the highlights, the sort of main points that illustrate what is critical for each of these perspectives. We do want to acknowledge that there are others. Now, that being said, when we start looking at Charcot and Janet here, who are French physicians, which means my pronunciation was probably not close, but they were seeking to treat patients with symptoms that had no apparent physical cause. These individuals will probably not come up ever again, but they gave Freud his start. So we start here. So if they're treating patients that have symptoms, but no physical cause of those symptoms, they called this condition hysteria. And you might have heard of this before. At the very least, we know that it's the root of the word being hysterical. So hysteria is some sort of extreme symptom being shown. Things like individuals who were blind or deaf or experiencing pain or paralysis even, with no physical nerve damage or brain damage that could explain those symptoms. So they started looking for some underlying cause that's non-physical. And of course, you can probably see where Freud comes into play here. So Freud is our Austrian physician who really wanted to focus on treating individuals, specifically individuals with hysteria, as well as other nervous disorders. And this is really important because at the time, if we start looking at this time period, this is in the late 1800s. So if you care, 1886 is when Freud first established his practice. And if we think about it, psychology has only really been around as its own independent field since about the 1870s. So this is very new. And specifically, the idea of using this sort of psychology field as a method of treatment was very much not common at the time. So Freud was a trailblazer because he was pushing for treatment of these disorders. So he's our founder of the psychoanalytic school of thought, or you might see this called the psychoanalytic theory. But all of this centers around the idea that our unconscious, the stuff in our mind that's sort of hidden below our conscious awareness, is what's influencing our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And of course, if this is our unconscious, this is stuff that's below our current awareness. It's stuff that we are not able to recall or think about, stuff that's going on behind the scenes. This is something where we're saying there's hidden drives to our actions. People are feeling particular ways and they don't know why because it's run in this deep, dark unconscious. And this is an idea that's going to come up throughout a whole bunch of later topics throughout the semester. But again, this is our starting point. And Freud ends up being very important because he was very vocal and very prolific in his ideas. So he stressed how important the unconscious is. He focused a lot on how early traumas, so when we talk about childhood and childhood distress, that could be something that has long-term impacts on adult behavior. And we do know that early experiences definitely shape later life events, but Freud really leaned into that sort of traumatic and hidden and repressed component where the unconscious is the major driving force here. Now, before I go too far into sort of what was going on at the time, because that'll become relevant later and we'll talk about it later, we should also give my definition here of psychoanalysis, which is the actual therapeutic technique or approach that Freud was using. And this is when you try and give patients something called insight into their unconscious minds. And with insight, the point here was to have the patients almost become aware of what was going on behind the scenes to give them the ability to access some of that under the surface process. And by becoming aware of that, they might be able to then change their actions because now it's not so much a hidden process as something they're now aware of and therefore in control of. So, an interesting thought and an interesting approach to be taken when trying to treat these different disorders. And when we talk about some of the approaches he was using, this is where a lot of people's sort of mental idea of what a psychologist is can come from. Freud is where we get the idea of having sort of the therapist's couch, and you sit there and your therapist talks at you and tells you to maybe make word associations. Things like, if I say this word, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Also things like Rorschach ink blot tests, abstract things like that, and asking you what it makes you think of or how it makes you feel, that would fall under this umbrella of psychoanalysis. It even included things like dream analysis, whatever Freud could use to try and gain some of his own insight into what was going on behind the scenes. And if you can't access it directly, then these indirect methods were his way of sort of peering into that deep darkness. And of course, when we talk Freud, we always hint at the fact that he was very held up on things like early childhood, early traumas, and a lot of repressed, darker urges. So he talks a lot about sex and violence, which we'll mention much, much more in later chapters. But to try and keep myself focused on what's important for each of these perspectives, the big ones where we have multiple slides, I've put together our little take-home notes. So what's our cool notes from this? We're saying that this perspective is focused a lot on how our unconscious mind influences our behavior. So behavior is driven by stuff that we are not actively aware of, something we are not conscious of. It's stuff behind the scenes. So Freud and his psychoanalytic theory is going to be the important point to take from this, but we will eventually start talking about some of our neo-Freudians in later chapters, specifically looking at Jung and Adler, among others. So that's our starting perspective. And as I mentioned, Freud being very vocal and prolific with all of his different theories and ideas, and we'll actually see that he had opinions on lots of things, all the way from looking at intelligence, we'll see him in personality, we'll see him in social interactions, he keeps coming up, but his ideas, and especially how extreme they were very important because basically they made enough people really mad that they came up with their own very different theories. So a lot of our other perspectives looked at what Freud was doing and said, absolutely not. here's what we think is happening instead. So one of our first major dynamic swings away from that more psychodynamic perspective is behaviorism. And behaviorism is another one of those perspectives where people are going to immediately think of one particular individual. So our psychodynamic perspective, immediately Freud. Our behaviorist perspective, you're probably going to think either Pavlov or Skinner. And yes, both of those are very important, and we are starting with Pavlov, and we will definitely talk about Skinner. But again, there are more individuals than just those two involved in this field. And typically, we start off with Pavlov, even though he technically wasn't part of the behaviorism to start. Pavlov's work predated this. So he ended up being, or I guess, start off, who is he? If you don't know, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, there we go, studying digestion. And of course, people think of Pavlov because of his salivating dogs. But he originally wasn't looking to study behavior. He was studying digestion and had his lab set up to be able to collect saliva from dogs so that he could distill it down and extract and look at enzymes. In fact, selling enzymes to, say, pharmaceutical areas, and I guess at the time it wouldn't necessarily be large companies, but selling to other researchers, selling to people making tonics, selling enzymes was a pretty good way to fund a lab. So that's where a lot of his setup was coming from. However, through this process and through monitoring saliva production, he came to realize that his dogs would start salivating even before they were given food. So right off the bat, we know that if somebody puts delicious food in front of you, you're going to salivate. Dogs are the same way. You put a plate of food in front of a dog and it salivates. And if he wants to collect saliva, it's a fantastic way to make them salivate. But he found over time that the stimuli, the stuff going on in the environment, even before the dogs got food, started to make the dogs salivate. And the sort of cartoonized version of this is your grad students come in, they open the door and it rings a bell above the door, and then they go and they give the dogs food. And eventually just the sound of the bell over the door ringing would make the dog salivate as if they had been given food. So we'll talk more about that throughout the semester, but that's a very basic version of classical or Pavlovian conditioning. So if we wanted to get a simple statement of what this kind of conditioning is all about, we're saying that through experience, by learning from stuff in our environment, we can have a stimulus in the environment come to elicit a physical response that it didn't cause to happen before. So from our dog and bell and food example, that bell is our stimulus in the environment. Originally, a bell means nothing to a dog, but because that bell is reliably paired with the dog getting food, eventually the bell elicits or produces the same physical response as if the dog had gotten food. So this association between the bell and the food ends up producing a physical response and a new response because they didn't used to salivate to the bell. So this is something really interesting, and it highlights one of the core principles of behaviorism, which is how important the environment is and how we learn through experience with different stimuli in our environment. So that's one of our starting points. We'll come back and look at classical conditioning and how it compares to other kinds of conditioning. But again, we'll have way more detail on these throughout the term. Our next important individual is actually the one that started this field. So like I said, Pavlov's research was sort of kicking around, but hadn't really spawned its own perspective, its own sort of field within psychology. But Watson ended up being the individual who's credited with becoming the head of behaviorism as a field. And the reason for this is that he thought that psychology should focus on the observable behaviors, the physical, overt, external aspects of behavior, rather than the unobservable inner consciousness aspects. And this is where we start seeing behaviorists really disliked Freud's approach. The idea that internal and unconscious events are solely responsible for many of our behaviors would drive a behaviorist nuts. So they decided, all right, we're going to go away from consciousness and we're going to focus only on these external overt behaviors and specifically looking at stimuli, events in the environment that can be producing certain behaviors. So that's where we have here, where we're saying that he's interested in understanding this stimulus response relationship. This is saying that we would like to understand the link between the stuff in the environment that produces a particular behavior. So we'll stick with Pavlov's example because it's something we've already talked through. So our stimulus in that situation would be our bell. Our bell comes to have a relationship with a response of salivating. So Watson would want to understand how something in the environment, the bell, the stimulus, comes to elicit a particular response through those occurrences of the bell and food being paired over time. So his main focus was that external force, external behavior, external stimuli in the environment. And all of this is pulling away from any kind of internal contribution. So we can really think of this as a almost radical reorientation of what they think psychology should be, because now it's all about observable behavior rather than those internal mental components. And we're focusing on environmental control of behavior and the role that learning has on linking that environment, our stimulus, to our behavior, our response. So lots of ideas put together there, but not overly complicated because we're just saying we no longer care about the internal. And of course, I had stressed at the very beginning when we were talking about our definition of psychology and the fact that, yeah, we have a particular definition we would like to use, but different perspectives would have different definitions. This is what I had in mind. With our behaviorists, they're going to have a very different definition of psychology. Specifically, they're looking at the study of behavior, where to them, behavior only includes overt or observable external physical actions. So for a behaviorist, they would not consider thoughts or any internal process as part of psychology. It's not something they're interested in, they completely ignore it. So what's the most extreme version of this? We're actually going to talk about Skinner. And Skinner is a behaviorist and oftentimes actually called a radical behaviorist because he took the behaviorist focus on that external environment and went to the extreme. So I actually have one of my quotes, or my favorite quotes from him, which is that no account of what is happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior. And what he's saying there is that, yeah, you could study the internal processes of the human body. You could study how people think. You can study all sorts of those internal actions, but it wouldn't help you come to understand human behavior. He goes on to say that you can understand every aspect of human behavior. You can explain all of our complex actions completely through environmental forces and experience with those external environmental factors. So he said, not only do we not care to study the internal, but it's completely pointless for psychologists to study anything internal at all. Again, that's why he's a radical behaviorist. He took it to the extreme. So he was inspired by Pavlov, again, took it a little bit more strongly than what Watson had originally proposed as well. But rather than what Pavlov had been looking at, where stuff happening in the environment can sort of automatically or passively end up producing certain responses. So the bell makes the dog salivate, even though the dog hasn't really done anything and there's no active process there. Skinner wanted to focus on more active behaviors, things like choosing to make a response. Though, of course, he doesn't like the internal process of making choice, so he wouldn't use that term at all. But it's easier to visualize if we use some more relaxed terms. So Skinner is known for, oh, okay, I see what I was doing here. I wanted to include our classical conditioning example as a comparison, not that I copy and pasted incorrectly. But here, so we have our classical definition on top because we just talked about it. We don't need to go through it again, but I like having them together. And usually when I have two related concepts together on a slide, that tends to be a hint that these would be two things you might want to be able to compare and contrast. Just saying. But where our classical conditioning focused on, yes, we're learning from experience, we're having a stimulus in the environment eliciting or causing a physical response to occur, basically automatically. With operant conditioning, sometimes also called instrumental conditioning, it's still all about the environment, and we're learning through experience yet again. But here, the important part is that an organism is modifying their behavior based on the consequences of their actions. So instead of a dog automatically salivating to a bell, here we'd have an organism intentionally carrying out an action because doing that action leads to some consequence. So we'll stick with dogs because it's easy to stick with dogs. But maybe you're training your dog to sit. And so you tell your dog sit, you say the words. That's now a stimulus present in the environment. If your dog sits after you say that word, then they're going to get a treat. So as a consequence of sitting, when they're told to sit, they get treats. So that's something where they want a good thing to happen. So next time you tell them to sit, they're more likely to sit. They've modified their likelihood of sitting based on the consequences of having sat for you in the past, which in the past got them treats, that got them something good. And we'll get to talk about that as reinforcement, where if you do something and that action leads to a good outcome, that outcome is now reinforcing that action. And that means that you're more likely to do that action in the future. We can actually frame it the other way too. You can use punishment. Maybe you want to stop your dog from barking when the doorbell rings. So if the dog barks when the doorbell rings, then maybe you're going to shout at them to stop barking. And in that case, their barking is followed by a bad outcome, and that would make them less likely to bark in the future. So by doing something and having a consequence that's bad, you can actually make them less likely to make that response, to do that behavior. So whether we're increasing the likelihood of a behavior or decreasing the likelihood of the behavior, it's all about, in our definition here, we're modifying our behavior because of the consequences that follow making that response, doing that behavior in the past. So, big take home here, stepping back, and why I have both of these concepts on the same slide. Classical conditioning is all about a stimulus and a response becoming almost automatically linked. The dog hears the bell and automatically salivates. That link came about because of experience, but it's something where the animal is not having sort of an active role in the process. With operant conditioning, we're focusing on the fact that engaging in a particular behavior, making a particular response, leads to a certain consequence. And if that consequence is good, then we see more of that action. And if the consequence is bad, we see less of the action. So here, this is a more active process where the animal is going to almost choose to make the response or not based on whether it leads to something good or something bad. And again, I'm using a lot more cognitive language about choosing to make a response, but that's only because it makes it easier to visualize. It is not something a behaviorist would like to include in their definitions, but we're using it for understanding purposes and acknowledging that shortcoming. But again, I put these two together because it's a good idea to be able to tell the difference between the two, knowing that one is more passive, one is more active, but the fact that both of them are being influenced by stuff that happens in our environment. The responses that we're talking about are always physical, observable, external responses. That stuff's really important to note because that's very critical to this behaviorism. And of course, once again, with the ones that have multiple slides, I have my take-home summary so we have it all together. And this is saying that with behaviorism, our perspective is focused on the influence our physical environment has on physical observable behavior. Our encounters with our external environment are going to have an effect on our behavior for a whole bunch of different reasons. So this is all about experience, the external environment, and physical behavior. And specifically, we're saying that the mind and other internal conscious components are going to be considered completely irrelevant when you have a behaviorist perspective. We will see a little bit later on when we get into cognitive psychology, the fact that there's kind of a little bit of a hybrid subfield, and it's called cognitive behaviorism, which mixes behaviorist ideas and a more cognitive approach. But I'm just hinting that that comes because behaviorism seems a little bit extreme, and a lot of people do still feel that, so you can have sort of crossover between fields. But I'll talk more about that when we get to that slide. Our next couple of topics here are going to be either very, very specific or very, very broad. The first of which here, Gestalt psychology, is kind of very specific. And this is a almost subfield that really looks at perception and how we put information together. So before I get into specific definitions, let's look at our individual. So Max Wertheimer, who we will never mention again and is therefore not super important beyond his contribution in general. He's a German psychologist who was interested in visual perception and specifically was interested in perceptual errors. So here, the idea that, say with illusions, if you've looked at optical illusions, you can have stimuli, say on paper or on your computer screen, that end up giving us an interpretation that's very different from the sensory reality of the stimulus that's present. And I actually have a fantastic example that I saved from one of my sensation and perception classes. So I'm going to scroll ahead a little bit here. For this is going to give the appearance of a flashing circle, so something moving in a circle. But I just wanted to make note that there is a little bit of flashing. So it's a white background with blue dots on it, and there will be just a small flash just in case that bothers anyone. But if I scroll ahead, this is something called apparent motion, and this is an optical illusion. And here what we have are, I think it's 8 blue dots. And one of those dots will be sort of made invisible. It's going to show up as white on the background. And they're going to turn white in sequence. So first the top one, then the one next to it, then the one next to that. But when we look at this, we actually view it like there is a white circle that's spinning around in a counterclockwise manner, even though none of these dots are actually moving. And this is something that our previous researcher had noticed when looking at things like flashing lights above movie theaters or billboards or whatever, where people interpreted them as movement, even though there's no actual movement. It's just things turning on and off. So I'll go off of that slide for us so we don't get too sort of visually stimulated. But this is a really good way of illustrating the key concept of Gestalt psychology, where we're looking at understanding how our minds are organizing and combining physical stimuli in the environment into a more holistic and subjective perceptual experience. And this is another one of those concepts I've mentioned before with that subjective nature of our perception, where we are interpreting stimuli and we're not always getting an exact one-to-one interpretation of what is physically present in the real world. So we have these distortions of reality because of how we interpret that stimulus. And if we're curious, where does that term come from, Gestalt psychology? Gestalt is actually the German word for whole. And the idea behind Gestalt psychology is that the whole is more than the sum of each individual element or each individual part. So we can interpret more from stimuli than what we would get if we just looked at the individual elements on their own. So, big take home from this one, and I don't know that there's another slide for it, but we're focusing on combining elements, combining stimuli into a perceptual whole, and our perceptual interpretation is something that can be subjective. Oh, and I do have one more name with Gestalt psychology, who is Bartlett. And this is looking not so much at sort of physical stimuli, and technically Bartlett doesn't count as a true Gestalt psychologist, simply because he is not German, he was British, but he was looking at the fact that this doesn't just apply to sort of external physical stimuli and perception, This also can apply to things like memory, where our recollections of events can actually be distorted. So our memories can also be subjective, and they can be influenced by things like expectation. So if you expect that something should have happened, then you're more likely to recall it having happened. So that'll be really important when we start looking at things like problem solving and perceptual sets, as well as memory in general. So an interesting addition here. But I do have my Gestalt psychology take home, which I already kind of did, but we're stressing. Perception is subjective. We will stress this over and over all semester. Gestalt psychology specifically talking about the whole being more than the sum of its parts, saying that our perception, our interpretation, will be different than what we get from each individual element in isolation. The way that we organize and put together those elements can change how we interpret that scene as a whole, and that's really important in understanding human perception. And that's why we talk about it as its own separate subfield. Our next field is developmental psychology. And as we're moving on, we're going to hit these a lot faster because as we get into more modern areas, it's not that we're getting to be less specific. It's actually just that there are so many different areas of research as we get more modern that it's kind of hard to pick out individuals to talk about. So we'll keep hitting sort of our famous names for as long as possible, but you'll find that I think after developmental psychology, we're going to sort of stop seeing specific names. But Piaget is our next one, and Piaget is a famous developmental psychologist, a Swiss psychologist who is interested in understanding the mistakes that children make as they get older. He's famous for actually studying his own children, which is something we'll talk about and have some issues with in the development chapter. But he looked at patterns in cognitive ability and also in physical ability as children get older. And he started observing patterns. And the thing that he was especially paying attention to are mistakes that children make. And basically trying to find where their logic or where their knowledge or where their abilities kind of failed to match what, say, an adult could do. Or even how a younger child might not be able to do something that an older child can do. One of the best examples, and again, something we'll talk about more in the development chapter, is looking at something called conservation. And this is an idea that if you take a glass full of water and you pour that glass of water into another container, you and I both know that the volume of water has not changed. However, children don't have that same understanding, or I guess young children don't have the same understanding that the volume stays the same, that the volume is conserved. They instead would look at the new shape, the new container that it's in, and they'd make a judgment about does it have more or less water based on the size of the container. So if the container is, say, taller and thinner, then the water line or the liquid line is going to go much higher. Then the children would assume that there's more liquid now. And if the container is shorter and fatter, and then the liquid takes up less visible space, they would say that now there's less liquid, even though we physically saw that the liquid volume has not changed, just the container size has changed. But when they're young, they don't have that same grasp of conservation. The same thing when you talk about, say, object permanence, where they say that for small children, if something is out of sight, they sort of forget that it exists. So the object is not in permanent existence because it ceases to exist when they no longer see it. And we'll talk about whether that is the case or not and what we know about that later on. But those are the things that Piaget was looking at, and specifically arguing that because some of these mistakes were present in certain ages and eventually were absent in older ages, there must have been some underlying developmental change that led to them stopping making that mistake. So something internally changed that allowed them to no longer make the error, and they could have a concept of object permanence or conservation of volume or mass or whatever. And those patterns were very consistent across the individuals he studied. So lots of history there. But what we're taking from this, and we'll do our definition first and then our take home, But developmental psychology, as we can probably tell, is interested in how these psychological phenomena and our cognitive abilities are going to change with age. So, unlike a bunch of the other areas and perspectives and fields, this acknowledges that our abilities, our capabilities are not static. They are something that changes and morphs as we get older. So, younger children will make mistakes that older children will not. And children of all ages will have very different thought patterns and logic than, say, adults. So that sort of change and that predictable change across time is what developmental psychology is really good at. So, unlike most of the others where we don't care so much about age and change over time, we're just looking at, say, adult abilities or external forces or whatever, developmental started taking into account change and flexibility across time. All right, next we have social psychology, and this is another one where the name kind of gives away what it is we're looking at, where social psychology is going to look at social interactions. This is again very human-centric, where we have individuals trying to understand how people interact with one another, how the behaviors of others influence our own behaviors, things like that. So we have a couple of names here, though none of these are really going to be super important right off the bat, mainly because these are ones that I glance at and know I don't talk about in the slides I've already made. So we're just going to use them as examples because they illustrate social psychology as a whole. We're not caring about these names as much as, say, Freud and Skinner. But Lewin is another one of our German psychologists, specifically interested in looking at social behavior in group settings. This is why it falls under social psychology. The interesting part here is that they argued against the environment being our driving force of behavior. That tells us that they're against our behaviorist perspective. They don't think that the physical environment is what's important. What do they think instead? That an individual's subjective perception of the environment is more important in driving behavior than the reality of that environment. That's a fantastic bridge between sort of saying we don't like the behaviorist approach, but they also accept some of the ideas that are critical to Gestalt psychology, and then they want to apply that to a more social and interaction-based understanding of human behavior. So we're starting to see that all of these ideas are sort of interconnected. And again, like I said at the beginning, we have certain fields that sort of sprouted up because they disagreed with other fields. So this is a great example of that. For some of our other social psychologists, we have Ash and Alport, who were looking at how people come to make inferences about others. Inferences are basically just assumptions. We as humans tend to take a lot of mental shortcuts, which can include things like looking at an individual and making some logical assumptions, maybe based on past experiences, maybe based on stereotypes and things that we've learned from culture. And this is sort of early into that research. We'll actually see very soon that we'll talk about cultural psychology as well, where we start including things like stereotypes and some of those group dynamics on a larger scale. But yeah, this was some early stuff looking at stereotypes and how people form stereotypes and inferences on small scale and how that changes the behavior towards others and how we react to the behaviors of others. Very, very interesting work. And we've already kind of covered our definition of social psychology, but just in case, we're saying that this field is interested in how people interact with one another and how their behavior can influence others or can be influenced by others. And our take home, people make assumptions. Our assumptions can influence our actions. Other people's behaviors can also influence our own behaviors. And the concept here of people being reactive, this means that simply by having other people present, individuals can change their behaviors. Their actions will change simply because they're being observed. And of course, as a research psychologist, having people's behavior change dramatically when somebody else is present makes it awfully difficult to try and monitor and observe and study behavior. So that'll be a problem we'll discuss more later on. All right, next into cognitive psychology. And I already kind of hinted we'd be heading in this direction with my cognitive behaviorism mention, but that's the next slide. First, we should talk about what cognitive psychology is as a whole. And the reason why we're talking about this now is because timeline-wise, this came up sort of after we started seeing popularity in social psychology and developmental psychology. That doesn't mean that these fields fell out of popularity, that they completely vanished. This just means that there was a period here, we actually call it the cognitive revolution, that was happening during the 1960s, where we started seeing a big push across the field of psychology as a whole, where at the time there were a lot of people who had some more behaviorist leaning theories, but we had others who were starting to sort of push back against that. So it's a revolution. It's pushing against some existing field and having a very different idea, a very different experience. So our cognitive psychologists were really interested in those internal mental processes, things like thought and reasoning, but also memory and perception, which we can logically see coming from some of those more recent fields we've discussed. So this perspective was really going against the behaviorists and the idea that the internal is irrelevant. They wanted to focus a ton on the internal. And because of the time in which this was occurring, so if you think 1960s, this is actually a time when technology was really on the rise. So coming out of World War II, there was a lot of big advancements in technology. And specifically, we started to see computers being something that were talked about a lot more. And were becoming a little bit more common to see at some of the larger universities and institutions. So we start to see some of the language used in describing humans coming from computers, actually. So they almost viewed humans as information processors, where we'd look at sort of a sensory input that yielded some kind of physical output after internal processing of that input information. And this is around the time when a lot of our modern theories on memory were coming about. And our memory theories, especially the ones that look at, say, our incoming information, sensory information, short-term information processing, short-term memory, and then long-term storage, a lot of that terminology also uses computer equivalent terms. So putting things into storage or retrieving things from memory, that's going to show some of those links. So that's something that'll keep coming up. But that's why we talk here about memory and even perception all being tied together through this one broader area. We also then see our cognitive behaviorism, which I keep bringing up simply because it is a nice bridge between the extremes of cognitive focusing on those internal processes and behaviorism focusing on only external environmental forces and kind of bridging the gap. But this is also where my own research falls. I am technically a cognitive behaviorist because I use very behaviorist techniques, operant conditioning, to study very cognitive questions. I look at forming categories and perceptual abilities in chickadees. So I really do try and take the best of both worlds. So a cognitive behaviorist looks at learning experiences and the fact that the environment provides the chance for those experiences. We encounter stimuli in the environment. It ends up affecting our behavior because it gives us information, stuff we can process internally, to then choose how to behave effectively in that environment. So we're acknowledging some kind of internal process in between the physical environmental stimuli and then our physical response. So again, best of both worlds, but this will come up even more later on. We then have the very modern stuff, talking about evolutionary psychology, where again, we see a resurgence in talking about evolution. So we mentioned this way back in the last section, talking about our structuralists, where they really wanted to look at where the mind, the structuralists were a lot more like cognitive psychologists, looking at sort of what the mind is and how it works. So the elemental components and how they go together. But our functionalists from the last section and our evolutionary psychologists would ask a lot more about what the mind is for why we might have evolved certain abilities and what forces of natural selection might have been acting in the past. So if I actually read my definition instead of trying to freeform this, we're saying that evolutionary psych is interested in how natural selection would have shaped the human mind and its abilities. So can we tell some evolutionary tale about how certain selective pressures in the past made certain cognitive abilities, certain perceptual abilities, common in the human race in the present? Our next section, very briefly, is neuroscience, which is not explicitly just psychology. This is also its own field because of its sort of growth and popularity in much more recent years. This is becoming a large field because we're having massive technological advancements where we're able to see things like better microscopes. We are able to actually record electrical activity in the brain so we can look at action potentials and patterns of firing within the brain. So this field is becoming a larger and larger field simply because we are capable of studying things in enough detail at this point. But for the very basics, we're going to talk about neuroscience as being interested in understanding the function of the brain, trying to connect maybe some of our physiological brain activity to either cognitive processes or external behaviors, which conveniently we have cognitive neuroscience looking at connections between the brain and the mind, those cognitive components, or behavioral neuroscience looking at relationships between the brain and our behavior. So the names are really fitting in this case. And while our textbook does specify that cognitive neuroscience is more studied in humans and behavioral neuroscience is more studied in non-human animals, I would say that that's a very loose recommendation because I do know that I know a lot of cognitive neuroscientists who do study cognition in non-human animals. So take that with a grain of salt. Then we have as our last very brief field of psychology or perspective is cultural psychology. And this is not so much an isolated area. This is something that can be embedded in a bunch of other perspectives as well. So cultural psychology is specifically interested in how culture can influence behavior. And this, of course, will overlap very heavily with things like social psychology, but it can also overlap with, say, developmental psychology. Because if we look at the culture that you grow up in, that can have a long-term effect on how your behavior changes with age. So I should state what our definition of culture is. It's going to be our shared experiences, values, beliefs, and so on that are all shared within a particular group. And when we think culture, we typically think of either people of a particular race or particular country of origin, but this can also be people of particular age groups. This can even be on a smaller scale, something like friend groups or within individual cities. This can be gender, whatever kind of identity can produce groups, it can all count as culture. And that's why this slide is very, very limited in content, not because it is a very simplistic idea, but because it integrates so much into a broad array of areas that I can't really encompass it all here. So we're introducing it here, and we'll see much, much more of this as we move through the rest of the semester. And just at the end here, we have our chapter wrap up. And this is where I've tried to put together what are the most important concepts that you should make sure that you know from this chapter. This isn't to say that the stuff not on this slide is not important, but this is saying this is the stuff that I looked at and said these would make very good exam questions. So you really want to know the difference between psychological, biological, and environmental explanations of behavior. We talked a lot about monism and dualism, as well as our empiricism and nativism and structuralism, functionalism. Those are all concepts where I presented almost opposing points, opposing viewpoints or opposing ideals, and stressed how one or the other might think about something. So whenever I do that, whenever I present, these two things are interrelated, I often end up asking questions that tells you to interpret those or tell the difference between those or compare and contrast them. So keep that in mind. And then, like I said, this last section, all about those psychological perspectives, those are all important. We want to know what is the core concept for each of those, what's the core idea, what makes that perspective unique. We also want to know about how they are similar to others or different from others. Are there some that go together really well or disagree with others? That's something you should know. And I tried to make that clear as we went through, but maybe think about which ones agree with one another, which ones are similar, which ones might work together well, and which ones have opposing ideas and why. So that's a good spot to start with studying. So I will leave us there for this chapter, and we'll come back for the next chapter next time.